Welcome back to our course on modern architecture, and this is the last in our series of lectures on Frank Lloyd Wright. So we moved through an overview, brief biography, the Prairie Style, Larkin and Unity, his work in the 1920s, 30s, 50s. We looked at patterns in the 20th century. But Frank Lloyd Wright is known for organic architecture. And we haven't explained what that is. So let's take a look at what we mean by organic architecture. And to put it simply, Frank Lloyd Wright had a lot of different meanings for this term. He meant natural materials. He meant relating to the natural features of the site. He meant the American democratic spirit. He meant an architecture of essences. And he meant an organic worldview. So let's see what we mean by each one of these. So let's start with natural materials. So what's the problem if we say natural materials? So here is Johnson wax, where he uses brick. And we tend to think, well, you know, brick and wood are natural, and steel and glass are not so natural. But if you think about it, that doesn't make any sense. Here we are with Frank Lloyd Wright's first Jacob house, the Usonian house we mentioned, and on the right is Mies van der Rohe's German pavilion, or the Barcelona pavilion. And we'd say, well, Mies has all of this glass and steel, slabs of stone cut by modern tools, so that's not organic. But Wright has glass also. What makes his glass organic and Mies is not? So it's a fuzzy concept. You know, it's not a definite, clear concept, but we sort of mean materials that are closer to their natural state when we say natural materials. But an example of how tricky this is a house I didn't show you before. It's called Wing Spread near Racine, Wisconsin. This is the bedroom, and look at this cantilever. This is not done with wood. There are monster steel beams in here making this possible. So, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright would fool around with this idea. Next thing, we mean relating to the natural features of the site. And of course, we immediately have in mind Frank Lloyd Wright's falling water. So here it is built into the landscape. The stream actually runs right under the house. So it's clear what we mean here, but now here we compare falling water to Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie, and it relates to its landscape also. It's just a different kind of relationship. And so there's no such thing as not relating to the landscape. It's different attitudes toward the human place and nature. So that's something for you to think about. Then we have the idea of embodying the American democratic spirit. And here we can make another comparison to Europe. So the slogan of the French Revolution was Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, freedom, equality, brotherhood. So if we say these are the three elements of democracy, in America, there's a tendency to emphasize freedom and individuality. In Europe, there's a tendency to emphasize equality. So both Europe and America are democratic cultures, but there's a difference in emphasis. And Frank Lloyd Wright is in the American sense of emphasizing individuality. So let's make another comparison here with Corbeau. Here we have a house I didn't show you, the Hanna House. Very interesting because it's on a hexagonal grid. And here's the Millard House that I showed you. And so these two are very different from each other. Different clients, different climates, different locations. Here is Unité d'Habitation by Le Corbusier, and the units are all very similar. And so each of these cell-like units are not quite identical, but you know, we might say identical. Le Corbusier once gestured at a drawing of this, and he said, 1,000 people, one entrance. So there's this European sense of everybody getting an equal, similar household, and the American sense of this individuality. So that's what Wright means by the American democratic spirit, the freedom for each individual to be themselves. Then we have the notion of an architecture of essences. Now, this is a tricky idea, but remember we had that slide in our very first lecture. Remember we had that slide in our second lecture by Louis Sullivan where he said the germ is the real thing, the seat of identity. Within its delicate mechanism lies the will to power. Well, Frank Lloyd Wright writes something similar when he says, what is honor? Not the rules of a code, but the nature of honor. What would be the honor of a brick? Now, what does that mean? By honor, he means essence. He says, that in the brick which makes the brick a brick. In other words, there's an inner will in the brick wanting to be square, hard, red. And this is not a position agreed upon by all philosophers, but it is a position of the transcendentalists out of whose tradition Wright comes, and it's seeing an inner quality in something. We say in architecture, steel wants to be thin and tenuous and in tension. Concrete wants to be squat and in compression, so that there's a nature to a material, and we want to be true to that nature and express it. So that's what Frank Lloyd Wright means by an architecture of essences. And finally, an organic worldview. So what do we mean by that? So here again is Palladio's Villa Rotunda, and it is putting the human being in the center, and it is dominating its landscape. From here we survey out. So it sees the human being as the central and most important thing. Now, here we are at Katsura Imperial Villa in Japan, integrated with its landscape, meandering into its landscape, interpenetration of inside and outside, and sort of flowing through its landscape. In the traditional East, we see the human being as integral with its landscape as opposed to standing outside and above it. Now, let's look at something. Here is Villa Rotunda. In the middle is Katsura. And then finally, on the right is Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. Which of these other two is Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture more like? So there's something for you to think about. So let's end with the question, what is our notion today of the human place in the world? We saw Frank Lloyd Wright's notion, we saw the Western humanist notion, we saw an Eastern notion. And is this notion of the human place in the world everywhere the same? And finally, how might that be expressed in our architecture? Thank you.